Part One of The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Pierard. The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Part One. It is doubtful if Aggie and I would have known anything about Tish's plan had Aggie not seen the advertisement in the newspaper. She came to my house at once in violent excitement and with her bonnet over her ear, and gave me the newspaper clipping to read. It said, "Wanted, a small donkey. Must be gentle, female, and if possible, answer to the name of Modestine. Address X27 Morning News." "Well," I said when I had read it, "did you insert the advertisement or did you propose to answer it?" Aggie was preparing to take a drink of water, but the water being cold and the weather warm, she was dabbing a little on her wrists first to avoid colic. She looked up at me in surprise. "Do you mean to say, Lizzie," she demanded, "that you don't recognize that advertisement?" "Modestine?" I reflected. "I've heard the name before somewhere. Didn't Tish have a cook once named Modestine?" But it seemed that that was not it. Aggie sat down opposite me and took off her bonnet. Although it was only the 1st of May, the weather, as I have said, was very warm. "To think," she said heavily, "that all the time while I was reading it aloud to her, when she was laid up with neuralgia, she was scheming and planning and never saying a word to me. Not that I would have gone, but I could have sent her mail to her, and at least have notified the authorities if she disappeared." "Reading what aloud to her? Her mail?" I asked sharply. "Travels with a Donkey," Aggie replied. "Stevenson's Travels with a Donkey. It isn't safe to read anything aloud to Tish any more. The older she gets, the worse she is. She thinks that what anyone else has done, she can go and do. If she should read a book on poultry farming, she would think she could teach a young hen to lay an egg." As Aggie spoke, a number of things came back to me. I recalled that, the Sunday before, in church, Tish had appeared absorbed and even more devout than usual, and had taken down the headings of the sermon on her missionary envelope, but that, on my leaning over to see if she had them correctly, she had whisked the paper away before I had had more than time to see the first heading. It had said, "Rubber Heels." Aggie was pacing the floor nervously, holding the empty glass. "She's going on a walking tour with a donkey, that's what, Lizzie," she said, pausing before me. "I could see it sticking out all over her while I read that book. And if we go to her now and tax her with it, she'll admit it. But if she says she is doing it to get thin, don't you believe it." That was all Aggie would say. She shut her lips and said she had come for my recipe for caramel custard. But when I put on my wraps and said I was going to Tish's, she said she would come along. Tish lives in an apartment, and she was not at home. Miss Swift, the seamstress, opened the door and stood in the doorway so we could not enter. "I'm sorry, Miss Aggie and Miss Lizzie," she said, putting out her left elbow as Aggie tried to duck by her, "but she left positive orders to admit nobody. Of course, if she had known you were coming, but she didn't." "What are you making, Miss Letitia?" Aggie asked sweetly. "Summer clothes?" "Yes, some little thin things. It's getting so hot." "Hm, I see you are making them with an upholsterer's needle," said Aggie, and marched down the hall with her head up. I was quite bewildered, for even if Tish had decided on a walking tour, I couldn't imagine what an upholsterer's needle had to do with it, unless she meant to upholster the donkey. We got down to the entrance before Aggie spoke again. Then, "What did I tell you?" she demanded. "That woman's making her a—" But at that very instant there was a thud under our feet and something came ping through the floor, not 6 inches from my toe, and lodged in the ceiling. Aggie and I stood looking up. It had made a small round hole over our heads. and a little cloud of plaster dust hung round it. "Somebody shot at us," declared Aggie, clutching my arm. "That was a bullet." I stooped down and felt the floor. There was a hole in it, and from somewhere below I thought I heard voices. It was not very comfortable standing there on top of heaven knows what, but we were divided between fear and outrage, and our indignation won. With hardly a word we went back to the rear staircase and so to the cellar. Halfway down the stairs both of us remembered the same thing, that it was Tish's day to use the basement laundry, and that perhaps— Tish was not in the laundry, nor was Hannah, her maid, but Tish's blue and white dressing sack was on the line, and the blue had run, as I had said it would when she bought it. In the furnace room beyond we heard voices, and Aggie opened the door. Tish and Hannah were both there. They had not heard us. "Nonsense!" Tish was saying. "If anybody had been hit, we'd have heard a scream. Or if they were killed, we'd have heard 'em fall." "I heard a sort of yell," said poor Hannah. "I don't like it, Miss Tish. The time before you just missed me." "Why did you stick your arm out?" demanded Tish. "Now take that broomstick and we'll start again. Did you score that?" "How'll I score it?" asked Hannah. "Hit or miss?" She went to the cellar wall and stood waiting, with a piece of charcoal in her hand. The whitewashed wall was marked with rows of X's and ciphers. The ciphers predominated. "Mark it a miss." "But I heard a yell." "Fiddle-dee-dee. Are you ready?" Tish had lifted a small rifle into position and was standing, with her feet apart, pointing it at a white target hanging by a string from a rafter. As she gave the signal, Hannah sighed, and, picking up a broom handle, started the target to swaying, pendulum fashion. Tish followed it with the gun. I thought things had gone far enough, so I stepped into the cellar and spoke in ringing tones. "Letitia Carberry," I said sternly. Tish pulled the trigger at that moment and the bullet went into the furnace pipe. It was absurd, of course, for Tish to blame me for it, but she turned on me in a rage. "Look what you made me do!" she snapped. "Can't a person have a moment's privacy?" "What I think you need," I retorted, "is 6 months' complete seclusion in a sanitarium." "You nearly shot us in the upper hall," Aggie put in warmly. "Well, as long as I didn't shoot you in the upper hall or any other place, I guess you needn't fuss," said Tish. "Ready, Hannah." This time she shot Hannah in the broom handle and practically put her hors de combat. But the shot immediately after was what Tish triumphantly called a clean bull's-eye. That is, it hit the center of the target. That is the time to stop when one has made a bull's-eye in any sort of achievement, I take it. And Tish is nobody's fool. She took off her spectacles and wiped the perspiration and gunpowder streaks from her face. She was immediately in high good humor. "Every unprotected female should know how to handle a weapon," she said oracularly, and sitting down on the edge of the coal bin, proceeded to swab out the gun with a wad of cotton on the end of a stick. "The poker has been good enough for you for 50 years," I retorted. "And if you think you look sporty, or anything but idiotic, sitting there in a flowered kimono and swabbing out the throat of that gun—" Just then the janitor came down, and Tish gave him $1 for the use of the cellar. It did not mention the furnace pipe. Aggie and I glanced at each other. Tish's demoralization had begun. From that minute to the long and entirely false story she told the red-bearded man in Thunder Cloud Glen several days later, she trod, as Aggie truthfully said, the downward path of mendacity, bringing up in the county jail and hysterics. We went upstairs, Tish ahead and Aggie and I 2 flights behind, believing that Tish with an unloaded gun was 1,000 times more dangerous than any outlaw with an entire arsenal loaded to the muzzle. We had a cup of tea in Tish's parlor, but she kept us out of the bedroom, where we could hear Miss Swift running the sewing machine. Finally Aggie set out of a clear sky. Have you had any answers to your advertisement?" Tish, who had been about to put a slice of lemon in her tea, put it in her mouth instead and stared at us both. "What advertisement?" "We know all about it, Tish," I said, "and if you think it proper for a woman of your age to go adventuring with only a donkey for company—" "I've had worse," Tish snapped. "And I'm not feeble yet, as far as my age goes. If I want to take a walking tour, it's my affair, isn't it?" "You can't walk with your bad knee," I objected. Tish sniffed. "You're envious, that's what," she sneered. "While you are sitting at home, overeating and oversleeping and getting fat in mind and body, I shall be on the broad highway, walking between hedgerows of well, between hedgerows. While you sleep in stuffy, upholstered rooms, I shall lie in woodland glades in my sleeping bag and see overhead the constellation of what's its name. I shall talk to the birds and the birds will talk to me." Sleeping bag? That was what Aggie had meant that Miss Swift was making. "What are you going to do when it rains?" "It doesn't rain much in May. Anyhow, a friendly farmhouse and a glass of milk, even a barn." Aggie got up with the light of desperation in her eyes. Aggie hates woods and gnats, has no eye for nature, and for almost half a century has pampered her body in a feather-bed poultice, with the windows closed, until the 1st of June each year. Yet Aggie rose to the crisis. "You shan't go alone, Tish," she said stoutly. "You'll forget to change your stockings when your feet are wet, and you can't make a cup of coffee fit to drink. I'm going too." Tish made a gesture of despair, but Aggie was determined. Tish glanced at me. "Well," she snapped, "we might as well make it a family excursion. Aren't you coming along too, to look after Aggie?" "Not at all," I observed calmly. "I'll have enough to do looking after myself. But I like the idea, and since you've invited me, I'll come, of course." At first I am afraid Tish was not particularly pleased. She said she had it all planned to make 4 miles an hour, or about 40 miles a day, and that anyone falling back would have to be left by the wayside. And that, if we were not prepared to sleep on the ground, or were going to talk rheumatism every time she found a place to camp, she would thank us to remember that we had really asked ourselves. But she grew more cheerful finally, and seemed to be glad to talk over the details of the trip with somebody. She said it was a pity we had not had some practice with firearms, for we would each have to take a weapon, the mountains being full of outlaws, more than likely. Neither Aggie nor I could use a gun at all, but, as Tish observed, we could pot at trees and fence posts along the road by way of practice. When I suggested that the sight of 3 women of our age (we are all well on toward 50), Aggie insists that she is younger than I am, but we were in the same infant class in Sunday school. 3 women of our age potting at fences was hardly dignified. Tish merely shrugged her shoulders. She asked us not to let Charlie Sands learn of the trip. He would be sure to be fussy and want to send a man along, and that would spoil it all. What with the secrecy, and the guns and everything, I dare say we were like a lot of small boys getting ready to run away out west and kill Indians. In fact, Tish said it reminded her of the time, years ago, when Charlie Sands and some other boys had run away, with all the carving knives and razors they could gather together, and were found a week later in a cave in the mountains, 20 miles or so from town. Tish showed us her sleeping bag, which was felt outside, and her old white fur rug within. Aggie planned hers immediately on the same lines, with her fur coat as a lining, but I had mine made of oilcloth outside. My rheumatism having warned me that we were going to have rain, I was right about the rain. I had an old army revolver that had belonged to my father, and of course Tish had her coal cellar rifle, but Aggie had nothing more dangerous than a bayonet from the Mexican War. This being too heavy to carry, and dull, being only possible as a weapon, by bringing the handle down on one's opponent's head. Aggie was forced to buy a revolver. The man in the shop tried to sell her a small pearl-handled one, but she would not look at it. She bought one of the sort that goes on shooting as long as one holds a finger on the trigger, a snub-nosed thing that looked as deadly as it was. She was in terror of it from the moment she got it home, and during most of the trip it was packed in excelsior, with the barrel stuffed with cotton, on Modestine's back. Which brings me to Modestine. Tish received 3 answers to her advertisement. One was a mule, one a piebald pony with a wicked eye, and the third was a donkey. It seemed that Stevenson had said that the pack animal of such a trip should be cheap, small, and hardy, and that a donkey best of all answered these requirements. The donkey in question was, however, not a female. Tish was firm about this. But on no more donkeys being offered, she bought this one and called him Modestine anyhow. He was very dirty, and we paid $1 extra to have him washed with soap powder, as our food was to be carried on his back. Also the day before we started, I spent an hour or so on him with a fine comb, with gratifying results. I must confess I entered on the adventure with a light heart. Tish had apparently given up all thought of the aeroplane. Her automobile was being used by Charlie Sands. The weather was warm and sunny, and the orchards were in bloom. I had no premonition of danger. The adventure, reduced to its elements of canned food, alcohol lamp, sleeping bags, and toothbrushes, seemed no adventure at all, but a peaceful and pastoral excursion by 3 middle-aged women into green fields and pastures new. We reckoned, however, without Aggie's missionary dime. Aggie's church had sent each of its members a 10-cent piece, with instructions to invest it in some way and to return it multiplied as much as possible in 3 months. This was on Aggie's mind, but we did not know it until later. Really, Aggie's missionary dime is the story. If she had done as she had planned at first and invested it in an egg, had hatched the egg in cotton wool on the shelf over her kitchen range and raised the chicken, eventually selling the chicken to herself for dinner at 75 cents, this story would never have been written. What the dime really bought was a glass of jelly wrapped in a 2-day-old newspaper. But to go back. We were to start from Tish's at dawn on Tuesday morning. Modestine's former owner had agreed to bring him at that hour to the alley behind Tish's apartment. On Monday Aggie and I sent over what we felt we could not get along without, and about 5 we both arrived. Tish was sitting on the floor, with luggage scattered all round her and heaped on the chairs in bed. She looked up witheringly when we entered. "You forgot your opera cloak, Lizzie," she said. "And Aggie has only sent 5 pairs of shoes." "I've got to have shoes," Aggie protested. "If you've got to have 5 pairs of shoes, 6 white petticoats, summer underwear, intermediates and flannels, a bathrobe, 6 bath towels, and a sunshade, not to mention other things, you want an elephant, not a donkey." "Why do we have a donkey?" I asked. "Why don't we have a horse and buggy, and go like Christians?" "Because you and Aggie wouldn't walk if we did," snapped Tish. "I know you both. You'd have rheumatism or a corn, and you'd take your walking trip sitting. Besides, we may not always keep to the roads. I'd like to go up into the mountains." Well, Tish was disagreeable, but right. As it turned out, the donkey, being small, could only carry the sleeping bags, our portable stove, and the provisions. We each were obliged to pack a suitcase and carry that. We started at dawn the next day. Hannah came down to the alley and didn't think much of Modestine. By the time he was loaded, a small crowd had gathered, and when we finally started off, Tish ahead with Modestine's bridle over her arm and Aggie and I behind with our suitcases, a sort of cheer went up. It was, however, an orderly leave taking, perhaps owing to the fact that Tish's rifle was packed in full view on Modestine's back. I have a great admiration for Tish. She does not fear the pointing finger of scorn. She took the most direct route out of town, and by the time we had reached the outskirts we had a string of small boys behind us like the tail of a kite. When we reached the cemetery and sat down to rest, they formed a circle round us and stared at us. Tish looked at her watch. We had been an hour and 20 minutes going, 2 miles. End of Part 1. Part 2 of The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Pierard. Part 2. We were terribly thirsty, but none of us cared to drink from the cemetery well. In fact, the question of water bothered us all that day. It was very warm, and after we left the suburban trolley line, where motormen stopped the cars to look at us and people crowded to the porches to stare at us, the water question grew serious. Tish had studied sanitation, and at every farm we came to the well was improperly located. Generally it was immediately below the pigsty. Luckily, we had brought along some blackberry cordial, and we took a sip of that now and then. But the suitcases were heavy, and at 11 o'clock Aggie said the cordial had gone to her head, and she could go no farther. Tish was furious. "I told you how it would be," she said. "For about 40 years you haven't used your legs except to put shoes and stockings on. Of course they won't carry you." "It isn't my feet, it's my head," Aggie sniffed. "If I had some water I'd be all right. If you're going to examine everything you drink with the microscope, you might as well have stayed home." "I'd have died before I drank out of that last well," snapped Tish. "One could tell by looking at that woman that there are dead rats and things in the water." "You are not so particular at home," Aggie asserted. "You use vinegar, don't you? And I'm sure it's full of wrigglers. You can see them when you hold the cruet to the light." We got her to go on, finally, and at the next well we boiled a pailful of water and made some tea. We found a grove beside the road and built a fire in our stove there, and while Modestine was grazing we sat and soaked our feet in a brook and looked for blisters. Tish calculated that as we had been walking for 6 hours, we'd probably gone 22 miles, but I believe it was about 8. While we drank our tea and ate the luncheon Hannah had put up, we discussed our plans. Tish's original scheme had been to follow the donkey, but as he would not move without some one ahead, leading him, this was not feasible. "We want to keep away from the beaten path," Tish said with a pickle in one hand and her cup in the other. "These days automobiles go everywhere. I'm in favor of heading straight for the mountain." "I'm not," I said firmly. "Here in civilization we can find a barn on a rainy night." "There are plenty of caves in the mountains," said Tish. "Besides, to get the real benefit of this we ought to sleep out, rain or shine. A gentle spring rain hurts no one." We rested for 2 hours. It was very pleasant. Modestine ate all that was left of the luncheon, and Aggie took a nap with her head on her suitcase. If we had not had the suitcases, we should have been quite contented. Tish, with her customary ability, solved that. "We need only one suitcase," she declared. "We can leave the other 2 at this farmhouse and pack a few things for each of us in the one we take along. Then we can take turns carrying it." Aggie wakened finally and was rather more docile about the suitcases than we had expected. Possibly she would have been more indignant, but her feet had swollen so, while she had her shoes off, that she could hardly get them on at all, and for the remainder of the day her mind was, you may say, in her feet. At 4 we stopped again and made more tea. The road had begun to rise toward the hills and the farmhouses were fewer. Ahead of us loomed Thunder Cloud Mountain with the Camel's Back to the right of it. The road led up the valley between. It was hardly a road at all, being a grass-grown wagon track with not a house in a mile. Aggie was glad of the grass, for she had taken off her shoes by that time and was carrying them slung over her shoulder on the end of her parasol. We were on the lower slope of the mountain when we heard the green automobile. It was coming rapidly from behind us. Aggie had just time to sit on a bank at her feet before it came in sight. It was a long, low, bright green car, and there were 4 men in it. They were bent forward, looking ahead, except one man who sat so he could see behind him. They came on us rather suddenly, and the man who was looking back yelled to us as they passed, but what with noise and dust I couldn't make out what he said. The next moment the machine flew ahead and out of sight among the trees. "What did he say?" I asked. Aggie, who has a tendency to hay fever, was sneezing in the dust. "I don't know," returned Tish absently, staring after them. "Probably asked us if we wanted a ride." "Lizzie, those men had guns." "Fiddlesticks!" I said. "Guns!" repeated Tish firmly. "Well, what of it? Our donkey has a gun." And as at that instant the sleeping bags and provisions slid gently round under Modestine's stomach, the green automobile and its occupants passed out of our minds for a while. By the time we had got the things on Modestine's back again, we were convinced he had been a mistake. He objected to standing still to be reloaded, and even with Tish at his head and Aggie at his tail, he kept turning in a circle, and in fact finally kicked out at Aggie and stretched her in the road. Then, too, his back was not flat like a horse's. It went up to a sort of peak, and was about as handy to pack things on as the ridgepole of a roof. For an hour or so more we plodded on. Tish, who is an enthusiast about anything she does, kept pointing out wildflowers to us and talking about the unfortunates back in town under roofs. But I kept thinking of a broiled lamb chop with new potatoes, and my whole being revolted at the thought of supper out of a can. At twilight we found a sort of recess in the valley, level and not too thickly wooded, and while Tish and I set up the stove and lighted a fire, Aggie spread out the sleeping bags and got supper ready. We had canned salmon and potato salad. We ate ravenously, and then, taking off our shoes and our walking suits, and getting into our flannel kimonos, and putting up our crimps, for we were determined not to lapse into slovenly personal habits, we were ready for the night. Tish said there were all sorts of animals on Thunder Cloud, so we built a large fire to keep them away. Tish said this was the customary thing, being done in all the adventure books she had read. Aggie had to be helped into her sleeping bag, her fur coat having been rather skimp. But once in, she said it was heavenly, and she was asleep almost immediately. Tish and I followed, and I found I had placed my bag over a stone. I was, however, too tired to get up. I lay and looked at the stars twinkling above the tree tops, and I felt sorry for people who had nothing better to look at than a wall-papered ceiling. Tish, next to me, was yawning. "If there are snakes," she observed drowsily, "they are not poisonous, I should think. And anyhow, no snake could strike through these heavy bags." She went to sleep at once, but I lay there thinking of snakes for some time. Also, I remembered that we'd forgotten to leave our weapons within reach, although, as far as that goes, I should not have slept a wink had Aggie had her Fourth of July celebration near at hand. Then I went to sleep. The last thing I remember was wishing we had brought a dog. Even a box of cigars would have been some protection. We could have lighted one and stuck it in the crotch of a tree, as if a man was mounting guard over the camp. This idea, of course, was not original. It was done first by Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the detective. It must have been toward dawn that I roused, with a feeling that some one was looking down at me. The fire was very low and Aggie was sleeping with her mouth open. I got up on my elbow and stared round. There was nothing in sight, but through the trees I heard a rustling of leaves and the crackling of brushwood. Whatever it was, it had gone. I turned over and before long went to sleep again. At daylight I was roused by raindrops splashing on my face. I sat up hastily. Aggie was sleeping with the flap of her bag over her head, and Tish, under an umbrella, was sitting fully dressed on a log, poring over her road map. When I sat up, she glanced over at me. "I think I know where we are now, Lizzie," she said. "Thunder Cloud Mountain is on our left, and that hill there to the right is the Camel's Back. The road goes right up Thunder Cloud Glen." I looked at the fire, which was out, at Modestine standing meekly by the tree to which he was tied, at the raindrops bounding off Aggie's round and prostrate figure. And I rebelled. Every muscle was sore. It hurt me even to yawn. "Letitia Carberry," I said indignantly, "you don't mean to tell me that, rain or no rain, you are going on?" "Certainly I am going on," said Tish, shutting her jaw. "You and Aggie needn't come. I'm sure you asked yourselves. I didn't." Well, that was true, of course. I crawled out and, going over, prodded at Aggie with my foot. "Aggie," I said, "it is raining and Tish is going on anyhow. Will you go on with her or start back home with me?" But Aggie refused to do either. She was terribly stiff, and she had slept near a bed of Mayapple blossoms. In the twilight she had not noticed them, and they always bring her hay fever. "I'm going to stay right here," she said firmly, between sneezes. "You can go back or forward or whatever you please. I shan't move." Tish was marking out a route on the road map by making holes with a hairpin, and now she got up and faced us. "Very well," she said. "Then get your things out of the suitcase, which happens to be mine. Lizzie, the canned beans and the sardines are yours. Aggie, your potato salad is in those 6 screw-top jars. Come, Modestine." She untied the beast and, leading him over, loaded her sleeping bag and her share of the provisions on his back. She did not glance at us. At last, when she was ready, she picked up her rifle and turned to us. "I may not be back for a week or 10 days," she said icily. "If I'm longer than 2 weeks, you can start Charlie Sands out with a posse." Charlie Sands is her nephew. "Come, Modestine," said Tish again, and started along. It was raining briskly by that time, and thundering as if a storm was coming. Aggie broke down suddenly. "Tish! Tish!" she wailed. "Oh, Lizzie, she'll never get back alive. Never! We've killed her." "She's about killed us," I snarled. "She's coming back." Sure enough, Tish had turned and was stalking back in our direction. "I ought to leave you where you are," she said disagreeably, "but it's going to storm. If you decide to be sensible, somewhere up in the valley is the cave Charlie Sands hid in when he ran away. I think I can find it." It was thundering louder now, and Aggie was giving a squeal with every peal. We were too far gone for pride. I helped her out of her sleeping bag and we started after Tish and the donkey. The rain poured down on us. At every step torrents from Thunder Cloud and the Camel's Back soaked us. The wind howled up the ravine and the lightning played round the treetops. We traveled for 3 hours in that downpour. End of Part 2. Part 3 of The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Pierard. Part 3. Only once did Tish speak, and then we could hardly hear her above the rush of water and roar of the wind. "There's one comfort," she said, wading along knee-deep in a torrent. "These spring rains give nobody cold." An hour later she spoke again, but that was at the end of that journey. "I don't believe this is the right valley after all," she said. "I don't see any cave." We stopped to take our bearings, as you may say, and as we stood there, looking up, I could have sworn that I saw a man with a gun peering down at us from a ledge far above. But the next moment he was gone, and neither Tish nor Aggie had seen him at all. We found the cave soon after, and climbed to it on our hands and knees, pulling Modestine up by his bridle. A more outrageous quartet it would have been impossible to find, or a more outraged one. Aggie let down her dress, which she had pinned round her waist, releasing about a quart of water from its folds, and stood looking about her with a sneer. "I don't think much of your cave," she said. "It's little and it's dirty." "It's dry," said Tish tartly. "Why stop at all?" Aggie said sarcastically. "Why not just have kept on? We couldn't get any wetter." "Yes," I added, "between flowering hedgerows. And of course these spring rains give nobody cold." Tish did not say a word. She took off her shoes and her skirt, got her sleeping bag off Modestine's back, and went to bed with the worst attack of neuralgia she had ever had. That was on Wednesday, late in the afternoon. It rained for 2 days. We built a fire out of the wood that was in the cave, and dried out our clothes, and heated stones to put against Tish's right eye, and brought in wet branches to dry against the time when we should need them. Aggie sneezed incessantly in the smoke, and Tish groaned in her corner. I was about crazy. On Thursday, when the edge of the neuralgia was gone, Tish promised to go home the moment the rain stopped and the roads dried. Aggie and I went to her together and implored her. But, as it turned out, we did not go home for some days. And when we did... By Thursday evening Tish was much better. She ate a little potato salad, and we sat round the fire, listening to her telling how they had found the runaways in this very cave. "They had taken all the hatchets and kitchen knives they could find and started to hunt Indians," she was saying. "They got as far as this cave, and one evening about this time they were sitting round the fire like this, when a black bear—" We all heard it at the same moment. Something was scrambling and climbing up the mountainside to the cave. Tish had her rifle to her shoulder in a second, and Aggie shut her eyes. But it was not a bear that appeared at the mouth of the cave and stood blinking in the light. It was a young man. "I beg your pardon," he said, peering into the firelight, "but you don't happen to have a spare box of matches, do you?" Tish lowered the rifle. "Matches?" she said. "Why, certainly. Aggie, give the gentleman some matches." The young man had edged into the cave by that time, and we saw that he was limping and leaning on a stick. He looked round the cave approvingly at our 3 sleeping bags in an orderly row, with our toilet things set out on a clean towel on a flat stone and a mirror hung above, and at our lantern on another stone, with magazines and books grouped round it. Aggie, finding some trailing arbutus just outside the cave that day, had got 2 or 3 empty salmon cans about filled with it, and the fur rug from Tish's sleeping bag lay in front of the fire. The effect was really civilized. "It looks like a drawing room," said the young man, with a long breath. "It's the first dry spot I've seen for 2 days, and it looks like heaven to a lost soul." "Where are you stopping?" "I am not stopping. I am on a walking tour, or was until I hurt my leg." "Don't you think you'd better wait until things dry up?" "And starve?" he asked. "The woods are full of nuts and berries," said Tish. "Not in May." "And there is plenty of game." "Yes, if one has a weapon," he replied. "I lost my gun when I fell into Thunder Creek. In fact, I lost everything except my good name. What's that thing of Shakespeare's? 'Who steals my purse steals trash.' But he—" Aggie found the matches just then and gave him a box. He was almost pathetically grateful. Tish was still staring at him. To find on Thunder Cloud Mountain a young man who quoted Shakespeare and had lost everything but his good name, even Stevenson could hardly have had a more unusual adventure. "What are you going to do with the matches?" she demanded as he limped to the cave mouth. "Light a fire if I can find any wood dry enough to light." "If I can't well, you remember the little match seller in Hans Christian Andersen's story, who warmed her fingers with her own matches until they were all gone and she froze to death." Hans Christian Andersen and Shakespeare. "Can't you find a cave?" asked Tish. "I had a cave," he said, "but what?" "Three charming women found it while I was out on the mountainside. They needed the shelter more than I, and so—" "What!" Tish exclaimed. "This is your cave?" "Not at all. It is yours. The fact that I had been stopping in it gave me no right that I was not happy to waive." "There was nothing of yours in it," Tish said suspiciously. "As I have told you, I have lost everything but my good name and my sprained ankle. I had them both out with me when you—" "We will leave immediately," said Tish. "Aggie, bring Modestine." "Ladies, ladies," cried the young man, "would you make me more wretched than I already am? I assure you, if you leave I shall not come back. I should be too unhappy." Well, nothing could have been fairer than his attitude. He wished us to stay on, but as he limped a step or two into the night, Aggie turned on us both in a fury. "That's it," she said. "Let him go, of course. So long as you are dry and comfortable, it doesn't matter about him." "Well, you are dry and comfortable, too," snapped Tish. "What do you expect us to do?" "Call him back. Let him sleep here by the fire. Give him something to eat. He looks starved. If you're afraid it isn't proper we can hang our kimonos up for curtains and make him a separate room." But we did not need to call him. He had limped back and stood in the firelight again. "You haven't seen anything of the bandits, have you?" he asked. "Bandits?" "Train robbers. I thought you had probably run across them." All at once we remembered the green automobile and the four men with guns. We told him about it and he nodded. "That would be they," he said. As Tish remarked later, we knew from that instant that he was a gentleman. Even Charlie Sands would probably have said "them." They got away very rapidly, and I dare say an automobile would be— Did one of them have a red beard? "Yes," we told him, "the one who called to us." Well, he said that on Monday night an express car on the C&L Railroad had been held up. The pursuit had gone in another direction, but he was convinced from what we said that they were there in Thunder Cloud Glen. As Tish said, the situation was changed if there were outlaws about. We were three defenseless women, and here was a man brought providentially to us. She asked him at once to join our party and look after us until we got to civilization again, or at least until the roads were dry enough to travel on. "To look after you," he said with a smile. "I with a bad leg and no weapon." At that Aggie brought out her new revolver and gave it to him. He whistled when he looked at it. "Great Scott!" he said. "What a weapon for a woman! Why, you don't need any help. You could kill all the outlaws in the county at one loading." But finally he consented to take the revolver and even to accept the shelter of the cave for the night anyhow, although we had to beg him to do that. "How do you know I'll not get up in the night and take all your valuables and gallop away on your trusty steed before morning?" he asked. "We'll take a chance," Tish said dryly. "In the first place, we have nothing more valuable than the portable stove. And in the second place, if you can make Modestine gallop, you may have him." It is curious, when I look back, to think how completely he won us all. He was young, not more than 26, I think, and dressed for a walking tour. In knickerbockers, with a blue flannel shirt, heavy low shoes and a soft hat. His hands were quite white. He kept running them over his chin, which was bluish, as if a day or two's beard was bothering him. We asked him if he was hungry, and he admitted that he could hardly remember when he had eaten. So we made him some tea and buttered toast, and opened and heated a can of baked beans. He ate them all. Good gracious, he said with the last spoonful, what a world it would be without women. At that he fell into a sort of study, looking at the fire, and we all saw that he looked sad again, and rather forlorn. Yes, Tish said, you're all ready enough to shout beware of women until you are hungry or uncomfortable or hurt, and then you are all just little boys again, crying for somebody to kiss the bump. But when it is a woman who has given the bump? He asked. Aggie is romantic. Years ago she was engaged to a Mr. Wiggins, a roofer, who met with an accident due to an icy roof. She leaned forward and looked at him with sympathy. "That's it, is it?" she asked gently. He tried to smile, but we could all see that he was suffering. "Yes, that's it. Partly, at least," he said. "That is, if it were not for a woman—" He stopped abruptly. "But why should I bother you with my troubles?" We were curious, of course, but it is hardly good taste to ask a man to confide his heartaches. As Tish said, the best cure for a masculine heartache is to make the man comfortable. We did all we could. I dried his coat by the fire, and Tish made hot arnica compresses for his ankle, which was blue and swollen. I believe Aggie would gladly have sat by and held his hand, but he crawled into his shell of reserve again and would not be coaxed out. "I have a nephew about your age," Tish said when he objected to her bathing his ankle. "I'm doing for you what I should do for Charlie Sands, under the same circumstances." "Charlie Sands!" he said, and I was positive he started. But he said nothing, and we only remembered that later. We were glad to have a man about. Heaven only knows why women persist in regarding men as absolute protection against fire, burglars, and lightning. But they do. A sharp storm came up at that time, and ordinarily Aggie would have been in her sleeping bag, with Modestine's saddle on top by way of extra protection. But now, from sheer bravado, she went to the mouth of the cave and stood looking out at the lightning. "Come and look at it, Tish," she said. Good gracious, there's a man across the valley with a gun." We all ran to the mouth of the cave except the walking tour gentleman, who had his foot in a collapsible basin of arnica and hot water. But none of us saw Aggie's man. When we went back, "Wouldn't it be better to darken things up a bit?" he suggested. "If there are bandits round it isn't necessary to send out a welcome to them, you know." This seemed only sensible. We put the fire out and sat in the warm darkness. And that was when our gentleman told his story. "Ladies," he began, "in saying that I am on a walking tour I am telling the truth, but only part of the truth. I am on a walking tour, but not for pleasure. To be frank, I am after the outlaws who robbed the express car on the C. & L. Railroad Monday night." I heard Aggie gasp in the dark. "Did you expect to capture them with a walking stick?" Tish demanded. She might treat his ankle as she would treat Charlie Sands' ankle, but Tish has not Aggie's confidence in people, or mine. "Perfectly well taken," he said good humoredly. "I left home with an entire arsenal in my knapsack, but, as I say, I lost everything when I fell into the flooded creek. Everything, that is, but my—" "Good name?" Aggie suggested timidly. "Determination. That I still have. Ladies, I'm not going back empty-handed." "Then you are in the government service?" Tish asked with more respect. "Have you ever heard of George Muldoon, generally known as Felt hat Muldoon?" Had we? Weren't the papers full of him week after week? Wasn't it Muldoon who had brought back the communion service to my church with nothing missing and only a dent in one of the silver pitchers? Hadn't he just sent up Tish's own Italian fruit dealer for writing blackhand letters? Wasn't he the best sheriff the county had ever had? "Muldoon!" gasped Tish. "You Muldoon?" "Not tonight or for the next 2 or 3 days. After that. Tonight, ladies, and for a day or two, why not adopt me to be your nephew? What was his name? Sands? Accompanying you on a walking tour? Adopt him? The great Muldoon? We'd have married him if he had said the word. name and all. We sat back and stared at him, open-mouthed. To think that he had come to us for help, and that in aiding him we were furthering the cause of justice. He talked for quite a long time in the darkness, telling us of his adventures. He remembered perfectly about getting back the silver for the church, and about Tish's Italian, and then, at last, finding us good listeners, he told about the girl. "Is it money?" Aggie breathlessly asked. "Well, partly," he admitted. "I don't make much, of course." "But with the rewards and all that?" asked Aggie, who'd been sitting forward with her mouth open. "Rewards? Oh, well, of course I get something that way. But it isn't steady money. A chap can't very well go to a girl's father and tell him that, if somebody murders somebody else and escapes, and he captures him, he can pay the rent and the grocery bill." "Is she pretty?" asked Aggie. "Beautiful." His tone was ardent enough to please even Aggie. He sat without speaking for a time, and none of us liked to interrupt him. Outside it had stopped raining, and the moon was coming up over the camel's back. We could hear Modestine stirring in the thicket, and a watery ray of moonlight came into the cave and threw our shadows against the wall. "If only," said Sheriff Muldoon thoughtfully, "if only I could get my hands on that chap with a red beard." We all went to bed soon after. Aggie, as usual, went to sleep at once, and soon, from behind the kimono screen across the cave, loud noises told us that Mr. Muldoon also slept. It was then that Tish crept over and put her mouth to my ear. "That may be Muldoon all right," she whispered, "but if it is, he's got a wife and 2 children. Mrs. Muldoon is related to Hannah." End of Part 3. Part 4 of The Cave at Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Pierard. Part 4. Somehow, with the morning, our suspicions, if we had any, vanished. Mr. Muldoon had been up at dawn, and when we wakened, he had already brought water from a nearby spring and was boiling some in the tea kettle. Seen by daylight, he was very good looking. He had blue eyes with black lashes and dark brown hair, and a habit of getting up when any of us did that kept him on his feet most of the time. His limp was rather better, or his ankle. "That's what a little mothering has done for me," he said gaily, over his coffee and mackerel. "It's a long time since I've had any one to do anything like that for me." "But surely your wife—" began Tish. He started and changed color. We all saw it. "My wife? You've got a wife and 2 children, haven't you?" He looked at us all and drew a long breath. "Ladies," he said, "I see some of my painful history is known to you. May I ask, is it too much to beg that we do not discuss that part of my life?" Tish apologized at once. We could not tell, from what he said, whether he had been divorced or had lost them all from scarlet fever. Whichever it was, I must say he was not depressed for very long, although he had reason enough for depression, as we soon learned. "It's like this," he said. "They know I'm here in the glen, the outlaws, I mean. The red-bearded man, Naismith, has sworn to get me." "Get you?" from Aggie. "Shoot me. The other 3 all owe me grudges too, but Naismith's the worst. He's just out of the pen. I got him a 10-year sentence for this very thing, robbing an express car." "10 years!" I exclaimed. "You look as if you hadn't shaved in 10 years." He looked at me and smiled. "I'm older than you think," he said. "And anyhow, he got a lot off for good behavior. It's outrageous, the discount that's given to a criminal for behaving himself. He got, I think I am right when I say, yes, he was sent up in '07. He got 7 years off his sentence." We all thought that this was a grave mistake, and Tish, whose father was once warden of the penitentiary, observed that there was nothing like that in old times, and she would write to the governor about it. Tish has written to the governor several times. the last occasion being the rise in price of brooms. "It's like this," said Mr. Muldoon. "They've got the glen guarded. There's a man at each end and the rest are covering the hilltops. A squirrel couldn't get out without their knowledge. I might have before I got this leg, but now I'm done for." "Oh, no!" we chorused. "It amounts to that," he said dejectedly. "They've been watching you women, and they're not afraid of you. As long as I stay in the cave here, I'm safe enough, but let me poke my nose out and I'm gone. It's an awful thing to have to hide behind a woman's petticoats." We could only silently sympathize. It was bright and clear that day. The sun came out and tried the road below. It would have been a wonderful day to go on, but none of us thought of it. As Tish said, here was a chance to assist the law, and a fellow being in peril of his life. Our place was there. Even had we doubted Mr. Muldoon's story, we had proof of it before noon. A man with a gun came out on a ledge of rock across the valley and stood, with his hands to his eyes, peering across at our cave. Tish was hanging some of our clothing out to dry, and although she saw the outlaw as well as we did, she did not flinch. After a time the man seemed satisfied and disappeared. Tish came into the cave then and took a spoonful of blackberry cordial. As we knew, her intrepid spirit had not quailed. But, as she said, one's body is never as strong as one's soul. Her knees were shaking. We put in a quiet and restful afternoon. Mr. Muldoon had a pack of cards with him, and we played whist. He played a very fair game, but he was on the alert all the time. At every sound he started, and once or twice he slipped out into the thicket and searched the glen in every direction with his eyes. He had asked us, if the outlaws surprised us, to say that he was Tish's nephew Charlie Sands, and to stick to it. "Unless it's Naismith," he said, "he knows me." From that to calling us Aunt Tish, Aunt Aggie, and Aunt Lizzie was very easy. At 4 o'clock we stopped playing, with Mr. Muldoon easily the winner, and Aggie made fudge for everybody. Late in the afternoon Tish called me aside. She said she did not want Mr. Muldoon to feel that he was a burden, but that we were almost out of provisions. We had expected to buy eggs, milk, and bread at farmhouses, and instead we had been shut up in the cave. She thought there was a farm up the glen, having heard a cowbell, and she wanted me to go and find out. "Go yourself," I said, somewhat rudely. "If you want to be shot down in your tracks by outlaws, well and good. I don't." Aggie, called aside, refused as firmly as I had. Tish stood and looked at us both with her lip curling. "Very well," she said coldly, "I shall go. But if I get my neuralgia again from wading through the creek bottom, don't blame me." She put on her overshoes and, taking a tin bucket for milk and her trusty rifle, she started while Mr. Muldoon was showing Aggie a new game of solitaire. I went to the cave mouth with her and listened to the crackling of twigs as she slid down into the valley. She came into view at the bottom much sooner than I had expected, having, as I learned later, slipped on a loose stone and rolled fully half the way down. The next 2 hours seemed endless. Mr. Muldoon, tiring of solitaire, had rolled himself up in a corner and was peacefully sleeping, with his injured foot on Aggie's hopped pillow. Aggie and I sat on guard, one on each side of the cave mouth, and stared down at the valley, which was darkening rapidly. Tish had been gone 2 hours and a half, and no sign of her, when Aggie began to cry softly. "She'll never come back," she whimpered. "The outlaws have got her and killed her. Oh, Tish, Tish!" "Why would they kill her?" I demanded. "Because she's trying to buy milk and eggs?" "Because she knows too much," Aggie wailed. "We found their lair, that's why. Don't tell me this isn't an outlaw's cave. It's just built for it. They'll do away with her, and then they'll come after us." Aggie never carries a secret weight in her bosom. She always opens up her heart to the nearest listener. This probably relieves Aggie, but it does not make her a cheerful companion. 8 o'clock and darkness came, and still no Tish. I went into the cave and brought out my gun, and Aggie roused Mr. Muldoon and explained the situation to him. He grew quite white. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "What possessed her, anyhow? To the farmhouse? Why, they'll—" His face more than his words convinced us that the matter was really serious. He examined Aggie's revolver, which he mostly carried in his hip pocket, and, going to the mouth of the cave, listened carefully. Everything was quiet. The cave and both sides of the valley were in deep shadow, but over the ridge of the Camel's Back, across from us, there was still a streak of red sunset light. Mr. Muldoon looked and pointed. Against the background of crimson cloud, a man's figure stood out clearly. He was peering down toward us, although in the dusk he could hardly have seen us, and he carried a gun. Mr. Muldoon smiled faintly. "Well, they've spotted me, I guess," he said. "I'd better move on before I get you into trouble. They won't hurt women." "Why don't you shoot him?" Aggie asked. "It would be one bandit less. If you do arrest him, and he gets nearly all his sentence off for good behavior, he'll be out again in no time, doing more mischief." But at that moment we saw the man on the hill throw his gun to his shoulder and aim at something moving below in the valley. Aggie screamed, and I believe I did also. "Tish!" cried Aggie. "He's shooting at Tish!" And at that instant the bandit fired. He fired 3 times, and the noise of his gun echoed backward and forward among the hills. We thought we heard a yell from the valley. Then the next second there was a faint crack from below, and the outlaw's gun flew out of his hands. Mr. Muldoon's jaw dropped. "Did you see that?" he said feebly. "Did you see that shot?" The outlaw disappeared from the skyline, and perhaps 10 minutes later Tish crawled up to the cave and put down a tin pail full of milk, a glass of jelly wrapped in a newspaper, and a basket of eggs. Aggie fell on her and cried with joy. "Be careful of those eggs," Tish warned her. "That outlaw charged me 40 cents a dozen." "You gave him a good fright, anyhow," said Aggie fondly. "Fright?" "When you shot at him." "Oh, that one. I'm talking about the woman at the farm." "And the one on the hill over there?" "Oh, well, he fired at me, and I fired back. That's all." With an air of exaggerated indifference, Tish swaggered into the cave and took off her overshoes. "Hurry up supper, Ag," she said. Never before or since has she called Aggie Ag. "I'm starving." She said she had heard little or nothing. She had found the farmhouse, had bought her supplies from a surly woman, and had come away again. Asked by Mr. Muldoon if she had seen any men, she said she had seen a farmhand milking. That was all, except the outlaw on the hill. But under her calmness Tish was terribly excited. I could tell it by her glittering eyes and the red spot in each cheek. Manlike, Mr. Muldoon did not see these signs. He ate very little and sat watching her, fascinated. Only once, however, did he broach the subject. "I had no idea you were such a shot, Miss Letitia," he said. "That was a marvel." "Oh, I shoot a little," said Tish coolly. "Only for my amusement, of course." Mr. Muldoon made no reply. He was very thoughtful all evening, did not care to play whist, and watched Tish whenever he could, furtively. Tish herself was in an exalted mood, but not about the shot. She was modest enough about that. And with cause. Months after, she told us how it happened. She said she was carrying the eggs and milk with her left hand and had the gun in her right when a shot struck a tree beside her. She was so startled that her finger pulled the trigger of her own rifle, which was pointed up, with the result we know of. She would probably never have confessed even then, had she not taken rheumatic fever and thought she was dying. When Mr. Muldoon went out to fix Modestine for the night, Tish called us to the back of the cave. "I bought the milk and eggs," she said hurriedly, "and having a dime left, your missionary dime, Aggie, I borrowed it. I went back and bought a glass of jelly. Men like preserves. The woman wrapped it in a newspaper, and there is a full account of the robbery and of Muldoon being after the outlaws. He's after the outlaws, but he's after the reward, too. They're quoted at $1,000. "He can have the $1,000 for all of me," said Aggie. "$1,000!" said Tish. "$1,000 to hand in to the church as the return from your missionary dime! And if we don't get it, Muldoon will. As soon as he can get about on his leg he'll cease being hunted and begin to hunt. Why should he have it? He has plenty of chances, and we'll never have another." That was all she had a chance to say, Muldoon joining us at that moment. We retired early, but I did not sleep well. I wakened from time to time, and I could hear Tish stirring next to me. At last I reached over and touched her. "Can't you sleep?" I whispered. "Don't want to," she whispered back. "I've got it all fixed, Lizzie. We'll take those outlaws back to the city, roped 2 by 2." It was a cool spring night, but I broke into a hot perspiration. End of Part 4. Part 5 of The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Pierard. Part 5. Tish began with Mr. Muldoon the next morning. He could not leave the cave to carry up water, for daylight revealed another guard across the valley, and it was clear we were being watched. While Aggie and I went to the spring, Tish talked to him. She told him that he had undertaken too much, single-handed, and that he should have brought a posse with him. He agreed with her. He said that he had started with a posse, but that they had split up. Also, he insisted that but for his accident he could have managed easily. "I'm up against it," he said, "and I know it. They'll get me yet. For the last day or two they've been closing up round this cave, and in a night or two they'll rush it. They've got their headquarters at that farmhouse." "The thing for you to do then," said Tish, "is to get out while there is time. You can get help and come back." "And leave you women here alone?" "They're not after us," Tish replied, "and we've managed alone for a good many years. I guess we'll get along." But when she proposed her plan, which was that he should put on Aggie's spare outfit and her sunveil and ride out of the valley on Modestine's back in daylight, he objected. He said no outlaw worthy of the name would fall for a thing like that, and he said he wouldn't wear skirts, and that was all there was to it. But in the end Tish prevailed, as usual. "I'm going to the farmhouse this morning, and I am going to say that one of the ladies is leaving this afternoon and going back home. That will be you. I wish you had a razor, but the veil will hide that. They'll not molest you. You'll not only look like Aggie, you'll be Aggie." Well, it seemed to be his best chance, although none of us dared to think what might happen if the hat blew off or Aggie's gray alpaca ripped at the seams. We worked feverishly all day, letting out the dress and setting forward the buttons on her raincoat. Mr. Muldoon was inclined to be sulky. He sat at the back of the cave, playing solitaire and every now and then examining the road maps. Aggie was depressed too. But, as Tish said, getting rid of Muldoon was the first step toward the $1,000, and even if Aggie never got her gray alpaca again, it had seen its best days. That morning, while Aggie and I sewed and ripped and Mr. Muldoon sat back in the cave with the road map on his knees, Tish went to the farmhouse. She came back at 11 o'clock with the chicken for dinner and a flush on each cheek. "I fixed it, Mr. Muldoon," she said. "I talked to one of the outlaws." "What?" screeched Aggie. "He'd come in for something to eat, the red-bearded one. We had quite a chat. I told him we were traveling like Stevenson, with a donkey, but that one of the ladies had an abscess on a tooth and was going home. He said it was no place for women and offered himself as an escort." Mr. Muldoon groaned. "What am I going to do if one of them comes up and makes an ass of himself?" he demanded. "Kiss him?" Tish looked at him coldly. "You'll have your jaw tied up," she said. "That will cover your chin, and you needn't speak. Point to your jaw. Anyhow, they'll not bother you. I said the toothache had affected your disposition, and we were just as glad you were going. The red-haired man says he's got relatives near the mouth of the valley, and you can stay there overnight. One of the men folks pulls teeth in emergencies." It is hard, writing all this of Tish, to remember that she has always been a truthful woman. As Charlie Sands said later, when we told him the story and he had sat, open-mouthed, staring from one to the other of us, no one knows what depths of mendacity lie behind the most virtuous countenance. We started Aggie off at 2 o'clock that afternoon, sitting sideways on Modestine, jaw tied up, veiled and sun-hatted, with Aggie's flowered silk bag hanging to one wrist and a lunch basket on the other arm. Tish and I saw her down the hill and kissed her good bye. This was Tish's idea. I thought it unnecessary, but as a matter of fact, no matter what Charlie Sands may say, it was not a real kiss, going as it did through a veil and a bandage. The man with a gun watched her off, and Tish, having waved her out of sight round a curve, looked up at him and nodded. Far away as he was, he saw that and swept his hat off with quite an air. Tish's plan was very simple. She told us as we cleared up the cave after the day's excitement. "When I go for the evening milk," she said, "I shall mention that we have a young man with us, a stranger, who has hurt his ankle and cannot walk, and I'll ask for arnica. That's all." "That's all!" Aggie and I exclaimed together. "Certainly that's all. Sometime tonight they'll rush the cave." "You're a fool," said Aggie shortly. "Why?" demanded Tish. "We won't be in it. We'll be outside. The moment they are in, we'll start to shoot. Not one of them will dare to stick his nose out." When we told this to Charlie Sands, he slid entirely off his chair and sat on the floor. "Not really!" he kept saying over and over. "You dreamed it. You must have. A thing like that?" I hastened to explain. "Tish planned it," I said. I remember him, looking at Tish, who was crocheting as she told the story, and moistening his lips. He was quite green in color. End of Part 5. Part 6 of The Cave on Thundercloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Pierard. Part 6. Clipping from the Morning News of May the 7th. Sheriff ambushed. Remarkable experience of Muldoon and party in Thunder Cloud Glen. An extraordinary state of affairs was discovered by the relief party of constables, city and county detectives, and state constabulary sent to the relief of Sheriff Muldoon and his posse, who have been on the track of the C&L train bandits since last Monday. The relief party was sent out in response to a telephone message from a farmhouse in Thunder Cloud Glen and transmitted from the farmer's line to a long-distance wire. This message was to the effect that the sheriff and his posse, shut in a cave, were being held prisoners by the outlaws, being shot at steadily, and that so far every attempt at escape had been thwarted by the terrific fire of the bandits. A relief party in automobiles was rushed at once to the scene. Thunder Cloud Glen is a narrow valley between the Camel's Back and Thunder Cloud Mountain. A mile or so from the entrance to the glen, the road, always bad and now almost washed away by the recent heavy rains, became impassable. The party abandoned the machines and in skirmish order proceeded up the glen. Within an hour's time, firing was heard, and the rescuers doubled their pace. Passing a bend in the valley, the scene of the outrage lay spread before them. on the left the low mouth of a cave, and across the valley, on a slope of the Camel's Back, a faint cloud of smoke, showing where the outlaws had their lair. As the rescuers came in sight, the firing ceased, and an ominous stillness hung over the valley. The relief expedition had been seen by the imprisoned party also. Muldoon's well-known soft felt hat, tied to the end of a pole, was thrust from the cave mouth and waved vigorously up and down, showing that some of the imprisoned party still lived. One solitary shot was aimed at the hat, followed by profound quiet. Using every precaution, Deputy Sheriff Mulcahy deployed his men with the intention of closing in on the outlaws from all sides at the same time. At this time an interesting interruption occurred. From the underbrush at the foot of the Camel's Back emerged three elderly women, their clothing in tatters and in the wildest excitement. They insisted that the outlaws were in the cave, and, hysterical with fright from their terrible experience, declared that they had been holding the bandits in check and demanded the reward for their capture. They were rational enough in other ways and explained that they had been on a walking tour with a donkey. There was, however, no donkey. Deputy Sheriff Mulcahy, who was noted for his gallantry, sent the three women to a safe place at the rear of the party and detailed a guard to make them comfortable. It being thought possible that the women were accomplices of the outlaws, precautions were also taken to prevent their escape. No trace of the outlaws was found. Sheriff Muldoon and his three deputies, now enabled to leave the cave, joined the searchers. Every inch of Thunder Cloud Glen was searched, but without result. Across from the cave mouth, behind a heap of fallen rocks, was found the spot from which the outlaws had been shooting. The ground was trampled and the rock chipped by the return fire from the cave. Here, too, was found a new automatic revolver, a small rifle, and another gun of antique pattern. In a crevice of rock was discovered a flowered silk bag containing various articles of feminine use, including a packet of powders marked hay fever, a small bottle labeled blackberry cordial, and a dozen or so unexploded cartridges for the revolver. Convinced now that the three women were accomplices of the outlaws, and this corroborated by Sheriff Muldoon's statement that he had positively seen one of the three women peering over the rock and aiming a rifle at him, and that the same woman, 2 days before, had fired at him from the valley, knocking his gun out of his hand, Deputy Sheriff Mulcahy promptly arrested the women and had them taken in an automobile to the city. At the jail, however, it was discovered that an unfortunate error had been made, and the ladies were released. They went at once to their homes. While their names have not been divulged, it is reported that they are well known and highly esteemed members of the community, and much sympathy has been expressed for their disagreeable experience. Up to a late hour last night, no trace has been found of the outlaws. It is believed that they have left Thunder Cloud Glen and have penetrated farther into the mountains. Charlie Sands came for us at the jail. He asked us no questions, which I thought strange, but he got a carriage and took us all to Tish's. He did not speak a word on the way except to ask us if we had no hats. On Tish's reply meekly that we had left them in the cave, he said nothing more, but sat looking like a storm until we drew up at the house. I dare say we did look curious. Our clothes were torn and draggled, and although we had washed at the jail, we were still somewhat powdered, streaked, and grimy. Charlie Sands led us into Tish's parlor and shut the door. Then he turned and surveyed the three of us. "Sit down," he said grimly. We sat. He stood looking down at each of us in turn. "I'll hear the story in a minute," he said, still cold and disagreeable. "But first of all, Aunt Tish, I want to ask you if you realize that this last escapade of yours is a disgrace to the family?" "Nothing of the sort," Tish asserted with something of her old spirit. "It was all for Aggie's missionary dime. A moment," he said, holding up his hand. "I'm going to ask a question. I'll listen after that. Did you or did you not hold up the C. & L. express car?" We were too astounded to speak. "Because if you did," he said, "missionary dime or no missionary dime, I shall turn you over to the authorities. I have gone through a lot with you, Aunt Tish, in the past year." Aggie and I expected to see Tish rise in majesty and point him out of the room, but to our amazement she broke down and cried. "No," she said feebly, "we didn't rob the car. But oh, Charlie, Charlie! We nursed that wretch Muldoon, and fed him and sent him off on Modestine and Aggie's gray alpaca, and he got away. And if you say to go to jail, I'll go." "Muldoon?" "The wretch who said he was Muldoon. The train robber." Well, it took hours to tell the story, and when we had all finished and Aggie had gone to bed in Tish's spare room with hysteria, and Tish had gone to bed with tea and toast, Charlie Sands was still walking up and down the parlor, stopping now and then to mutter, "Well, I'll be," and then going on with his pacing. Hannah brought me a cup of junket at 8 o'clock, for none of us had eaten dinner. I was sitting there with the cup in my lap when the doorbell rang. Charlie Sands answered it. It was a letter addressed to all three of us. We called Tish and Aggie, and they crept in, very subdued and pallid. Charlie Sands opened the letter and read it. "Dear and charming ladies, I am abject. What can I say to you, who have just come through such an experience on my account? How can I apologize or explain? Especially as I am confused myself as to what really happened. Did Muldoon actually attack the cave? Were you in it when he arrived? Or is it possible that, with my foolish fabrication in your mind, you attempted— But that is absurd, of course. Whatever occurred and however it occurred, I am on my knees to you all. Even a real bandit would have been touched by your kindness. And I am not a real bandit any more than I am a real sheriff. I am an ordinary citizen, usually a law-abiding citizen. But as a result of a foolish wager at my club, brought about by the ease with which numerous trains have been robbed recently, I undertook to hold up a C&L train with an empty revolver, and to evade capture for a certain length of time. The first part was successful. The train messenger, on seeing my gun, handed me without a word a fat package. I had not asked for it. It was a gift. I do not even know what was in it. The newspapers say it is money. It might have been eggs, as far as I know. The second part would have been simple also, had I not hurt my leg. Things were looking serious for me when you found me. I shall never forget the cave, or the omelets, or the tea, or the fudge. I can never return your hospitalities, but one thing I can do. The express company offers a reward of $1,000 for my little package. Probably they are right and it is not eggs. Whatever it is buried under the tree where we tied our noble steed, Modestine. Please return the package and claim the reward. If you have scruples against taking it, remember that the express company is rich and the Fiji Islanders needy. Turn it in as the increased increment on Miss Aggie's missionary dime. Signed, The Outlaw of Thunder Cloud. We found the package, or Charlie Sands found it for us, and the express company paid us the reward. We gave it to Aggie, and with the exception of $50, she turned it all in at the church, where it created almost a riot. With the $50 we purchased, through Charlie Sands, a revolver with a silver inlaid handle, and sent it to the real Sheriff Muldoon. It eased our consciences somewhat. That was all last spring. It is summer now. Tish is talking again of flowering hedgerows and country lanes, but Aggie and I do not care for the country, and the mere sight of a donkey gives me a chill. Yesterday evening, on our way to prayer meeting, we heard a great noise of horns coming and stopped to see a four-in hand go by. A young gentleman was driving, with a pretty girl beside him. As we lined up at the curb, he turned smiling from the girl and he caught our eyes. He started, and then, bowing low, he saluted us from the box. It was Muldoon. End of Part 6. End of The Cave on Thunder Cloud by Mary Roberts Rinehart.